The Committee on House Administration will come to order. We have a number of members present, and we will be joined by several others as this hearing proceeds. As we begin, I want to note we're holding this hearing in compliance with the regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 8. We ask committee members and witnesses to keep their microphones muted when they are not speaking to limit background noise, and members will need to unmute themselves when seeking recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Witnesses will also need to unmute themselves when recognized for their 5 minutes or when answering a question. Members and witnesses, please keep your cameras on at all times. Even if you need to step away for a moment, please don't leave the meeting or turn your camera off. I'd also like to remind members that the regulations governing remote proceedings require that we cannot participate in more than one committee proceeding at the same time. At this time, with unanimous consent, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and have any written statements be made part of the record, and without objection, that is ordered. Our hearing today will examine the broad constitutional authority provided to Congress to regulate federal elections under Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution, known as the Elections Clause. The clause reads as follows, quote, "Times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, semicolon. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators." The text is clear. It prescribes a duty to states to make regulations for the time, place, and manner of congressional elections, but critically also provides Congress with a superseding power to make or alter such regulations at any time. During the Constitutional Convention and state ratification debates, the framers fought for the inclusion of the Elections Clause and the broad powers that it confers to Congress. For its supporters, the clause was necessary for self-preservation of the federal government in the face of potential state obstructions to congressional elections. In defense of the Elections Clause, Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 59 that, quote, "Its propriety rests upon the evidence of this plain proposition, that every government ought to contain in itself the means of its own preservation." The framers raised other concerns as well to defend the inclusion of the Elections Clause in the Constitution and the federal oversight over congressional elections that it would authorize. They warned about the potential for state lawmakers to abuse their powers and pass election regulations that would lead to unequal representation, such as partisan gerrymandering. They also warned about other forms of voter suppression in federal elections that would go unchecked unless Congress was empowered with the remedy of the Elections Clause to act. The framers' warning ring true today. Since the Supreme Court's 2013 Shelby County versus Holder decision, state legislatures around the country have passed a wave of voter suppression efforts, including strict voter ID laws, improper voter purges, and increasingly limited opportunities to access the ballot. And this pattern has only further escalated since the 2020 general election. Partisan gerrymandering by incumbent political parties, both parties, remains an ongoing obstacle to equal voting rights across various states. In our hearing today, we'll hear more about what the framers intended when they drafted and included the Elections Clause in our Constitution. Likewise, the Supreme Court has been consistent in construing the Elections Clause as providing, quote, paramount, unquote, powers to Congress to enact federal election regulations that preempt state regulations, and has interpreted such powers to be broad and expansive. For example, in Smiley v. Holm in 1932, the Supreme Court said, "These comprehensive words embrace authority to provide a complete code for congressional elections, which was not limited to just times and places, but to the numerous requirements as to procedure and safeguards which experience shows are necessary in order to enforce the fundamental right involved." In another case, Arizona versus Intertribal Council of Arizona in 2013, Justice Scalia, a renowned conservative justice, wrote for the court that the National Voter Registration Act's requirement that voters affirm their citizenship preempted Arizona's proof of citizenship requirement, relying on Smiley versus Holm and the understanding that the Elections Clause empowers Congress to preempt state regulations governing the times, places, and manner of holding congressional elections, and that times, places, and manner are comprehensive words. The NVRA is only one example of Congress exercising its Election Clause powers. Congress has long exercised its Election Clause powers to enact legislation covering various types of federal election regulations, from the Apportionment Act of 1842, which eliminated the general ticket system in favor of the congressional district, to modern examples, including the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 and the Uniformed and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act of 1986, as well as the Help America Vote Act in 2002. Reliance on the Election Clause as a source of congressional authority has long been supported on a bipartisan basis. Since the House began requiring bill sponsors to identify the constitutional authority for their proposed legislation in recent years, members have cited the Election Clause as the authority for their legislation more than 230 times. That includes scores of measures introduced by Republican members, many of which would have required steps to take certain states to take certain steps in how they conduct their elections or prohibited certain activities. In the last Congress, my colleague, Ranking Member Davis, introduced legislation to deny federal election grants to states that permit third-party individuals or groups to return voters' completed ballots to election officials. In doing so, he cited as the sole constitutional authority for his legislation the Elections Clause of the Constitution. But this authority can be used to empower states and citizens to make voting easier, safer, and more secure while ensuring that suppressive tactics and plans may not be used to limit or deny access to the ballot box. For example, Congress has endeavored to enact new democracy reforms, including H.R. 1, the For the People Act, under its Election Clause powers, as well as other constitutional provisions. H.R. 1 will help remedy ongoing voter suppression efforts across states, just as the framers intended. Far from a federal takeover elections, as claimed by some critics, H.R. 1 typifies an appropriate exercise of congressional authority. This hearing provides a rare opportunity to explore the contours of the Elections Clause and the sweeping constitutional powers it provides Congress to enact transformational democracy legislation. Like H.R. 1, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. And I understand Mr. Davis is on assignment today, may be joining us later, but I believe Mr. Stile will be offering his opening statement. So Mr. Stile, you are now recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Today's hearing is